So today I'll be setting up a self-deploying AWS infrastructure CI/CD pipeline through Terraform from scratch. And what that means is we'll create a pipeline that will grab Terraform code from GitHub. It's going to apply it on AWS, including the code that defines the pipeline itself. And this is going to give us not only version control over the infrastructure, but also the ability to deploy using secure and scalable cloud services such as CodePipeline and CodeBuild. And this obviously removes the need of maintaining a dedicated build server for this and all the headaches that come along with it. So even though this concept is not new and there's a lot of examples on the internet on how to do this, they tend to contain lots of noise within their project. So modules linked to third-party repositories, which you may not feel comfortable with. They may have additional resource declarations you don't need, and you're not really sure how to remove those. So the goal with this walkthrough is to create an easy to follow basic CI/CD pipeline from which you can build on. And so this is what the diagram looks like. We have a GitHub repository with a branch called main, and this branch sends notifications to the pipeline on whenever changes happen to the branch. The pipeline triggers. There's a source stage which downloads the source code, puts it on the pipeline artifact S3 bucket. The code is then passed to the build phases we see here. The first phase will run Terraform plan. On the second phase will run Terraform apply. There's an optional approval stage which you can choose to put in. And then there is the Terraform state S3 bucket, which is marked with a star because we need to create this one manually. So these are the list of things we need to take care of before we actually get started. We need to create a repository. I'm gonna use GitHub for our Terraform repository. We need to create an S3 bucket to store the Terraform state. We'll need credentials for Docker Hub so we can reliably download images from, specifically the Terraform image. We'll need to create a CodeStar connector so that we can link up AWS CodePipeline and GitHub to get that integration going. There's another method using webhooks which is being phased out, so we'll be using CodeStar connector. And finally, we have our dev environment. This is just cloning our GitHub repository locally so we can start making changes. So I'll start off by creating my repository. I'm just going to call it AWS-CICD-pipeline. Hopefully it's going to be available, and it is. I'm going to leave it public so you guys can download the source code right after, and I'm going to go ahead and create a repository. Next up, we'll go ahead and create our S3 bucket. I'm going to go to create bucket. I'm going to call it also AWS-CICD-pipeline if I'm able to. I'm not sure if that's going to be available or not. I'm going to enable versioning since we're going to be storing our state file. It's a good idea to have backups of that file. And I'm going to enable server-side encryption with default keys. Okay, so the name is not available. So I'm just going to call it, just going to add a Devo clock at the beginning to make it unique. Next up, we're going to store our Docker Hub credentials into Secrets Manager, and this is used by the code build phase to be able to download images reliably from without hitting rate limit errors from Docker Hub. So to do this, we need to create two key value pairs. The first one is going to be called username, and the second one is going to be called password. My username is going to be this. And I'm going to put a dummy password here for now just to illustrate what we need to do. We can call this code build / Docker Hub. Doesn't really matter what you call it. The only thing we need to get from this is the ARN of this secret. So we're going to copy this and we're going to store it somewhere safe. Next up, we want to go to CodePipeline. We want to expand the settings menu and click on connections. We're going to go ahead and create our CodeStar connector to GitHub so that we can integrate both applications. I'm going to call this GitHub pipeline. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Next up, it's going to ask us what application we want to install. So I'm going to create a new application here. I'm gonna point to my GitHub account, install the connector, and it's gonna give you an ID. We'll need to record this ID. Actually, we'll need to record the ARN, the full ARN. And finally, we will want to set up our dev environment. So what we'll need to do here is go to our GitHub repository and then clone our new project into your local machine. It's going to give you a warning just because you don't really have anything inside your repository. But that's okay. We're just going to start building stuff inside, so that's fine. You can ignore that warning, and then we're good to go. And finally, you will want to open up your new folder in your preferred IDE. I use Visual Studio, and so this is the location of our new project. So if I do git, there should be a folder git. There it is. So to begin, we're going to define our AWS provider, the version that we're going to use. We're also going to define the variables. So we have two variables so far. These are the CodeStar connector and the Docker Hub credentials that we put on the secrets manager. We're going to define them as variables for now, and we're also going to run Terraform for the first time to start using the S3 bucket for the state file. All right, so to start, I'm going to create two files. One of them is going to be called Terraform TFR. So it doesn't really matter what it's called as long as it has a proper extension. And in here, I'm going to add the two variables we talked about. So Docker Hub credentials and also the CodeStar connector credentials. And I'm just going to copy paste the values for these two things. So the Docker Hub credentials is going to be that, and my CodeStar ARN is going to be that. So you'll obviously want to replace those with your values. And the other file that we also wanted to create is I'm just going to call it state.tf. It has to have that TF extension for Terraform to pick it up. And this is just where I'm going to define the Terraform backend, or the location for the state file. So here we have to say what the name of the bucket is. This is the bucket that we created manually beforehand. So that's what the name is. I'm going to tell it to encrypt by default. So encrypt true. Key. This is what the name of the file is going to be. I'm going to call it Terraform TF. State and the region for the S3 bucket is USD1. I'm going to save this file, save this other file. The next file we want to create is our variable file. So you can call this variables TF, and this is where we have to define what variables we're going to be using in this project. We have two variables for now. So let me just copy paste the names from here. I'm going to say type string. My other variable is called CodeStar, and I'm going to do the same thing here, variable, and then type string as well. Save this file. My Terraform binary is my parent folder, and I'm using Terraform 14. So I'm going to say Terraform init to initialize the project, or the backend. And I'm going to say Terraform plan. No changes being made, which is fine because we don't really have any new resources. We just have a variable in our backend. The only thing that I would like to point out is that you will want to see the Terraform TF state file in here, and this defines what Terraform knows about. So this means that so far so good, and we can actually get started with the next tasks. So next up, let's go ahead and create the pipeline itself. So we've created the repository, we've created the Terraform state S3 bucket. We have this main branch by default. So now let's go ahead and create the requirements for the pipeline. So what we need to do is we need to create this bucket. We need to create the pipeline itself. we need to create a role which the pipeline can use to actually execute. Okay, so the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to create an S3 bucket. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it s3.tf. And if you want to look at how to create the bucket, all we need to do is look at the resource documentation from Terraform. And this is how we create a bucket. There's many different options depending on what options or flags you want to turn on or off. So I'm going to copy this basic config. I'm going to put it into a new file. I'm going to remove the tags first because I don't need tags in my resource. I'm going to call this pipeline artifacts. It has to be unique. Let's just call it pipelines artifacts devo. And I'm going to call the resource itself CodePipeline artifacts. I'm going to run Terraform init. And I'm also going to run Terraform plan. Okay, so it's asking us for the region for the provider. We haven't specified one, so let's just do this one now manually, and we'll add it permanently in the configuration file in a second. But we just want to look at what it's going to do. So right now the code is going to create a new resource called CodePipeline artifacts. It's going to be an S3 bucket, and these are all the defaults for that particular resource. I'm going to go ahead and apply this. Again, it's going to ask me for the region. And I'm going to say yes. Okay, so the bug, so then I think it doesn't like the underscores. So I'm just going to run this again. I'm going to do auto approve. So I don't have to type yes. It will ask me for the region, which I'll put in. All right, bucket is created. And now I'm gonna make it so that it doesn't ask me for the region all the time. So all I need to do is I'm gonna use the state file here real quick. I'm just gonna create a provider for AWS, and I'm just gonna set the default region to be US East 1. You can make this into a variable, you can turn this into whatever you want, but the idea is that it shouldn't ask me what the region is all the time. Next up, the next thing that we need is the role for CodePipeline. I'm going to create a new file called IAM. I'm going to create a new role called something like CodePipeline role or something like that. This resource is an AWS IAM role. And if we look at the documentation, it will tell us exactly what we need to do to create this resource. So let's type it in. We're looking for role, and this is what the role creation looks like. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it in here. I'm going to change the name to Terraform CodePipeline role. And I'm also going to use this as the name within AWS. This is Terraform name for the resource. This is the name from within AWS. And I'm going to change this policy because I copied it from the documentation. It says it's going to assume it allows us to assume the EC2 role. I'm going to go ahead and change this so that I can assume the CodePipeline role, which is the one I actually need. I'm going to remove the tags so I don't actually need it. And I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go ahead and auto approve that as well, just to execute that change. All right, so now we have the pipeline artifact bucket. We have a role to run the pipeline with. So now we need to create the actual pipeline. We need to create at least one of the phases as well. Pipeline requires minimum 2 stages. The first stage is the source stage, which is not in here, but it's in there by default that we need to create. And the second stage that we need to create will be the plan stage, and the code build stage itself needs a role. So let's go ahead and finish up the roles for the build and for the pipeline, and let's get started with the stages as well. So in addition to being able to run CodePipeline itself, our pipeline also needs the ability to do things like initiate the CodeStar connection to GitHub. It needs the ability to write artifacts to S3. It needs to be able to write to CloudWatch, to be able to write logs, for example. It needs to be able to trigger a code build. So there's a couple of permissions that we need here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a policy document, and then I'm going to attach it to our code pipeline role. Okay, so I've completed the policy for the pipeline. All I've done so far is I've added a few more permissions, specifically the ability to use the CodeStream connection as well as CloudWatch, S3, and code build. You can be more strict with this. I'm just basically allowing all resources within each different service, but you can go ahead and look at the default pipeline role that AWS creates for you and narrow down the permissions that you need. So I've created a policy document with this particular permissions. I've created an actual policy based on the JSON format of this data resource, and then I've attached that policy to our pipeline role. So now I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing for our code build. We need a code build role as well as some additional permissions for code build. So that code build has the ability to pass those permissions over to Terraform, so Terraform can do things like create and delete resources, write to CloudWatch, and so on. So let's go ahead and create the plan phase. So what this is going to be a code build project. And the code build project is gonna launch a Terraform Docker image, which is gonna use to run Terraform plan. And then the output will be visible to us. And then based on the output, we'll decide whether we wanna go ahead with the apply phase, which is kind of the approval stage, or if we just wanna go ahead and just straight up deploy without an approval. So let's go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this pipeline.tf, and within here we're going to create a new code build project. If we look at the documentation for code build, let's go here. Let's see what a code build project looks like. So we see that we need a role, which we've created already. We need a bucket, which we already have. The policy and so on. Let's look for the code build project section, which is this one. So this is kind of what we need. All right. So I'm going to copy this. Well, I'm not going to copy this because there's a lot of stuff in here that I don't need, but I can copy certain aspects of it. I'm going to go ahead and create or put this into a file here. I'm going to call this build project Terraform plan. Something that's easy to remember, and this is the name that shows up on AWS: Terraform CI/CD plan description, plan stage for Terraform. No, I'm not gonna set a timeout to it. Service role. This points to the role that we created on our IAM file. This is our code build role, so I'm gonna copy this and put it in here. Artifacts, we do want artifacts, and the artifacts come from pipeline. So we want code pipeline artifacts. This is why it's not such a great idea always to copy paste from the documentation, because they assume a lot of stuff that may not be the case for you. I'm gonna remove the cache section. As far as the environment, I'm gonna put in a small instance is good. Our image is going to come from Docker Hub, which is one of the reasons we created Docker Hub secrets on Secrets Manager. And what we want is a Docker image from Docker Hub pertaining to Terraform. And so if you go to the Docker Hub website and you look for Terraform, this is the Docker images available for Terraform. In my particular case, I happen to be using 14.3, so I'm going to use this image here as my image. You can make this into a variable as well if you want to. It's going to be a Linux type container, and the image pool credentials type, I'm actually going to use the service role. I want code build to use the service role So the role we created to be able to download these images and to be able to retrieve the credentials from the secrets manager. And the credentials are actually specified under the environment, and we can say registry credential. And we're going to say credential comes from our variable Docker Hub credentials, and the provider, it's secrets manager. That finalizes the environment section. And then I'm going to go into the source section, and I'm going to say type is going to be CodePipeline. And then the build spec, so we need to define our build spec file. This is what tells the build phase what to do. And we're going to point to a folder that doesn't exist yet. We're going to create this file in a second. And this is the file where we run, or this is the file that contains the instructions that tells Terraform what to do. So I'm going to be pointing to a file called plan build spec under the build spec folder. Again, this file does not exist, but we'll go ahead and create it right now, I guess. So we'll go ahead and create a new folder, call it build spec, and then here, create a new file called this. And within this file, what we want to do is we want to define our instructions. You can grab this is a YAML file, so the formatting and the spacing is rather important. So we're gonna say we want Terraform to do Terraform init, and then we want to do Terraform validate. This will make sure that our configuration is good, and if it isn't, it will just stop right there. For the next section, for the build section, as far as commands go, we want to run Terraform plan, and so the build phase will run Terraform plan. It will give us the output of that, and it will be visible to us on the next section. And as far as artifacts go, I don't really have any artifacts at this point, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Save this file. Let's go back to our pipeline file. And so I think this is pretty much it as far as the build phase goes. Let's go ahead and create the next build phase. I don't think I've closed. There it is. Let's go ahead and create the next build project for Terraform apply. It's going to be very similar values. I'm just going to change some of the values from plan to apply or deploy. We're going to use the same role, same Docker image, same credentials. This one's going to be called, we call it apply build spec. I'm going to copy this file into a new file. I'm going to rename it to, I think I called it apply build spec. And the only difference here is I still want to do init and validate. The only difference is I want to do apply and auto approve. And that will allow it to just automatically apply the changes if it gets to that particular stage. So now we have these two build projects. I'm going to run Terraform apply just to make sure that these projects are properly configured and everything's good to go. Seems like everything's fine. So I will go ahead and create the pipeline now. So the pipeline is going to put together everything that we've done so far. It's going to grab the two stages we've created separately. We're going to tie that into a single pipeline. We'll also define our source stage, which is the one that connects to GitHub and downloads the source code. It's going to pass the code into an artifact through S3. And then this will conclude the pipeline with this particular configuration block here. So let's do a resource AWS CodePipeline here. And we can call this CI/CD pipeline. Name doesn't matter, it's up to you. Let's check out the documentation to see what it takes to create this pipeline, and it will give us a sample of what it should look like. So it has a name, it has a role, it has an artifact store, which in our case is the bucket we created in the first step. We're not going to encrypt it, so we can skip this particular configuration block. The source stage goes first. This particular configuration is used in open authentication or webhooks, which will we're not going to do it this way. We're going to be using the CodeStar connection, which is a lot easier to implement. Then we're going to have a build phase. Actually, two build phases, because even though we have a plan and apply phase, as far as CodePipeline goes, they're both kind of a build stage configuration. And I think that's a pretty simple configuration. So let's go ahead and set up our pipeline. So at this point our pipeline was created. However, we can notice that it failed in the first step because we haven't really pushed any code to GitHub. So it's trying to download the code that doesn't exist at this point. So let's go ahead and do a git status, and let's add all these files to our GitHub project. And let's just say initial commit. And let's do a git push. As soon as we do git push, we'll be able to get Terraform, the pipeline triggered. There's a few files here that we shouldn't be including in here with large files. We need to add these to our gitignore project or gitignore file. So let me do that real quick. All right, we've gone ahead and pushed all the changes to GitHub. So what that should do is it should trigger the pipeline to run real quick. It might take a minute or two to detect a new change, so we should see this deploy shortly. So after a couple of fixes, including some typo updates and some fixes to our pipeline definition, we've gone ahead and deployed changes to our GitHub project or repository. Terraform has been able to apply those changes through CodePipeline successfully. So from this point forward, every time we need to run Terraform, we can just have CodePipeline run Terraform for us. If we want to trigger it, all we need to do is push code to our master branch. And so at this point, if you wanted to create a new VPC, for example, we could look at the documentation for VPC for Terraform. Let's go ahead and create a new file. I'm just going to call it vpc.tf, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new VPC called default. I'm going to give it a CIDR of 1.2.3.4. Actually, let's say 1.2.0.0/16. And if I were to just push this to GitHub, I could just say add commit, if I could type new VPC, git push, and then Terraform will take care of creating the VPC for me through CodePipeline. Terraform will go ahead and trigger, and which actually it just did just now. It's running the plan phase already. It's going to take about 25 to 30 seconds to deploy the Terraform Docker image, and which is going to run Terraform plan. It's going to validate the config that it looks okay from a syntax perspective, and then it's going to go ahead and trigger the apply phase. So all of this without running Terraform locally myself. That way I could have multiple members from my team also making changes and so on. And we'll just see this deploy, and then finally we'll be able to verify the VPC being created. All right, so the plan phase has succeeded. If we look at the Terraform plan, we can actually see that it's proposing to add a new VPC as we've specified. And if we look at the deploy phase as well, it's showing me that it was actually able to add one new resource, which is the VPC we created. And if I refresh the screen here, we'll see the new VPC right there. So that's it. So we've created a GitHub repository. We've been able to integrate it with CodePipeline through CodeStar connections. We've created a couple of build phases or stages in which we run Terraform plan and apply to make changes to our AWS environment through Terraform. We've created an S3 bucket to store our Terraform state file, as well as an S3 bucket for our pipeline artifacts. Link to this repository is in the video description. You can go ahead and fork it if you want to. You can make changes, expand on it, apply some fixes, propose some changes as well. And you can just use this as a foundation for your next Terraform project on AWS. Thanks for watching.